Okay, for today's devotion, I want to ask the question of how does your family handle bad memories? Or how does the group or organization you're with handle bad memories? For most people, we just tend to ignore them. We just want to forget them. And yet, we're surprised here when we look at what God really instructs his people to do. I'm looking at Deuteronomy 26, verses 1 through 11 in the Old Testament. This is the people in the desert. Moses has led them out of Egypt, and God's done many supernatural things. And they were in misery. They were being oppressed by the Egyptians. They had trouble. And so God brought them out, and now God's telling them, when I take you into the land that I have promised to you, this land flowing with milk and honey, here's what I want you to do in regards to your memory of that misery. So we might be a little surprised on how to handle bad memories as a group, as an organization, as a family. But God gives us some great instruction here. So let me go ahead and read verses 1 through 11. God says, once you have entered the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you take possession of it and are settled there, take some of the early produce of the fertile ground that you have harvested from the land the Lord your God is giving you, and put it in a basket. Then go to the location the Lord your God selects for his name to reside. Go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, I am declaring right now before the Lord my God that I have indeed arrived in the land the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. The priest will then take the basket from you and place it before the Lord your God's altar, and you should solemnly state before the Lord your God, my father was a starving Aramean. He went down to Egypt, living as an immigrant there with a few family members. But that is where he became a great nation, mighty and numerous. The Egyptians treated us terribly, oppressing us and forcing hard labor on us. So we cried out to help to the Lord, our ancestors' God, and the Lord heard our call. God saw our misery, our trouble, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, with awesome power and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land full of milk and honey. So now I am bringing the early produce of the fertile ground that you, Lord, have given to me. Set the produce before the Lord your God, bowing down before the Lord your God. Then celebrate all the good things the Lord your God has done for you and your family, each one of you along with the Levites and the immigrants who are among you. And what a great passage. God is telling them to go ahead and remember, actually state verbally this thing that has happened in your past. And then go ahead and remember what God has done. Remember the bad, but then remember the good. And the good is that God brought them out of that trouble. God brought them through that trouble. So for many of us, we've got bad things that have happened in our past. And sometimes we don't even recognize that it was God that brought us through those things. And we come to a point later in life where we say, wow, I don't know how I got through that. And so just personally, I can share with you that when my wife and I got married, at our first anniversary, we had had a stillbirth. So we'd buried our first child, full-term pregnancy. So that's really hard on a relationship. And her brother had a brain tumor and cancer, and he had died in that first year. And those two things happened about a month apart. So after 1 year, not a great start to a marriage, but here we are 28 years later, still married, and both love God at this point. So God brought us through that. In the Methodist tradition, John Wesley called this prevenient grace. Grace being unearned favor, that God has favored us, shown us favor, even though we don't deserve it. And the word prevenient just means before you even knew it. So God offers prevenient grace. So before we recognized God was involved in our lives, he brought us through some things. He took us through some things, brought us out of trouble and misery. I know some friends who were a little wilder when they were younger, and they said, I'm surprised I lived through my 20s or I lived through my teen years because they were a bit wild. And so God tells us how to handle those things corporately. So as a family, as a group, he says, what you do is you bring a thank offering, basically, and you remember, you recall the bad things. So instead of forgetting it, you want to remember it. You want to say, look, I went through life where things were bad. You don't just want to forget it. You don't want to act like you're perfect, like you've never experienced any bumps in the road, because we all know that that's a lie. All of us have experienced those bumps in the road. And then you want to give credit to God for bringing us through those things, because God brings us through our troubles. If we're still here, He's brought us through our troubles. And if we're in heaven with Him, well, He's brought us through our troubles in a way different way. But basically, God says, celebrate all the good things the Lord your God has done for you. Remember the bad, but celebrate the good. And so, wow, what a great thing to do. One of the things that recently has happened down south, the Confederate flag has been, we're not going to fly it, we're not going to show it. And yet this Confederate flag has flown over many courthouses over the years, many state houses. It's part of history. And while it's a part of history that does remind us of slavery, of how one race treated another race or mistreated or oppressed another race, I think it's all the more reason to remind us to keep those things, those emblems of that bad time, of the misery, of the bad things that we have done in America, the bad things that were done to us in America, depending on which end of the spectrum we're on. And to say, look, we're not going to go back to that. We're so glad that God brought our nation through that we're not a divided nation anymore, and celebrate that God has brought us through that. We are one people, we are one nation, and that racism is not the problem that it used to be. It seems in the past few years that's flared up a little more than I would have expected, and yet God has brought us through that, and so we can continue to thank God for bringing us through those hard things. So don't forget those things, but go ahead and remember them. That's what anniversaries are for. You remember the good times or you remember the bad times, and then you thank God for what He's done. So anniversaries for weddings can bring back many good memories or bad memories, but celebrate it. And our family's had a couple of funerals here recently. We're doing one this week. And again, we celebrate somebody's life. And while you remember all the good things and celebrate all the good things, nobody's life's perfect. And so it can bring up some bad memories. So yes, it's okay to remember those things. But in the end, we want to celebrate that God has brought us through those things. And we also want to be reminded in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, God works all things for good for those that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. So remember the bad, thank God for the good that He's brought you through, and it helps us to recognize and be in that humble, submissive position that it's God who brings us through those things. So how do you handle bad memories? Instead of just forgetting them, it's okay to remember them, but then also add to that a celebration of how God has brought you through those things. Great thing to think about, and great thing to actually practice, especially as you come to certain events, anniversaries of death dates, to celebrate that God has blessed you with that person for so many years, even though they're not with you. So how does your family handle those things? You can think about that, and how does God say we should handle those things? Well, celebrate how God has brought us through them. All right, I will catch you next time. Be blessed and be a blessing.